Between 1839 and 1843, plantation records across Wilcox County, Alabama, show an unusual pattern that medical historians still cannot fully explain. 6 young men from wealthy planter families, all described in private correspondence as suffering from excessive corpulence, vanished from social registers within months of each other. Their mothers claimed they had been sent to European academies or military schools in the North. But in the basement archives of the old Wilcox County Courthouse, there exists a collection of letters that tells a vastly different story. A story of maternal obsession, forbidden transformation, and a system of control so disturbing it challenges everything we think we know about power, shame, and human depravity in the antebellum South. What these mothers did to their sons in pursuit of an impossible ideal, and what one enslaved woman was forced to witness, has been deliberately erased from every official record until now. Before we continue with the story of what really happened to Thomas Harrington and the others like him, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you are about to hear has been buried in private family collections for over 180 years. Stories like this one, dark chapters of American history that refuse to stay buried, fascinate me as much as they haunt me. And I want to know where you are listening from tonight. Drop your state or city in the comments below. Let us see how far these forgotten American horrors reach. Natchez, Mississippi, in the spring of 1839, stood as a monument to Southern prosperity and carefully maintained appearances. Along the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, mansions rose like white temples, each one proclaiming its owner's superiority through Greek columns and manicured gardens that required dozens of enslaved hands to maintain. The city's plantation families competed not just in cotton yields and land holdings, but in the perfection of their bloodlines, the elegance of their daughters, and most importantly, the strength and vigor of their sons. These young men were expected to embody a very specific ideal: lean, athletic, commanding in presence, capable of managing vast estates and the hundreds of enslaved people who worked them. They were to be horsemen, marksmen, and, if necessary, duelists who could defend family honor with violence when words proved insufficient. Victoria Harrington had inherited Belmont Plantation from her late husband Jonathan in 1836, making her one of the wealthiest widows in Adams County. The estate occupied nearly 3,800 acres of prime cottonland 12 miles northeast of Natchez proper. At 38 years old, she had transformed herself into the arbiter of social acceptability among the plantation elite, hosting gatherings where every detail had to meet her exacting standards. The silver had to gleam at precisely the right angle. The flowers had to be arranged in elaborate patterns she had studied during a trip to Charleston. Her own figure remained severely thin through a regimen of vinegar water and corseting, so tight it left permanent marks on her ribs. She was undeniably fashionable, undeniably powerful, and undeniably alone in her determination to control every aspect of her world. But Victoria harbored a shame that no amount of wealth or social influence could conceal. Her only son, Thomas, at 17 years old, weighed nearly 280 pounds and showed no sign of conforming to the lean, vigorous ideal that Southern masculinity demanded. Where other planters' sons rode horses with easy confidence, Thomas struggled to mount without assistance from stable hands. Where young men of his class practiced marksmanship and prepared for the possibility of duels, Thomas avoided physical exertion entirely, preferring to spend his time reading in his father's library or walking alone through the less traveled paths of the plantation. His weight was not merely a physical characteristic to his mother. It was a deliberate rebellion, a public humiliation, a stain on the Harrington name that grew more pronounced with each passing month and each social gathering, where comparisons between families' children became inevitable. Victoria's friends, the other plantation mistresses, had begun to notice. Their comments were carefully coded, wrapped in false concern, but the message was clear. "How is dear Thomas managing? We have not seen him at the last several gatherings. I do hope his health is sound. He seems to have such difficulty with physical activities. Perhaps a military academy would suit him. Some young men require more rigorous discipline than home can provide." Each comment was a knife, slicing into Victoria's pride and her sense of control. She had built her reputation on perfection, on the ability to manage her household and her properties with flawless efficiency. Yet her own son refused to be managed. What Victoria never acknowledged publicly, what she perhaps could not admit even to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts, was that Thomas's weight had begun its dramatic increase following the death of his father in 1836. The official cause had been heart failure. The whispered truth, known only to a select few, was that Jonathan Harrington had taken his own life in his study, overwhelmed by guilt over the institution of slavery and his own participation in it. He had left letters discussing his plans to free the enslaved people on Belmont, plans that Victoria had immediately destroyed after his death. Thomas Harrington represented everything Victoria despised about weakness and lack of discipline. In her mind, his body was a manifestation of moral failure, a visible sign of character defects that needed to be corrected through force if necessary. She observed him constantly, cataloging every perceived flaw, every moment of what she considered self-indulgence. When he took a second helping at dinner, she made note of it. When he chose to read rather than ride with the other young men of the county, she saw it as evidence of his fundamental unsuitability for the role he would one day be expected to fill. Victoria's obsession with Thomas's appearance had roots that went deeper than simple vanity or social pressure. She had grown up as the daughter of a failed merchant, watching her father's business collapse and her family's social standing evaporate in the span of 2 years. Her marriage to Jonathan Harrington had been her escape from poverty and obscurity, her chance to build a life of significance and respect. She had transformed herself from the daughter of a bankrupt nobody into the mistress of one of Mississippi's great estates. Every aspect of her life had been carefully constructed. Every detail managed to project an image of perfection and control. Thomas's weight threatened all of that. It suggested that she could not manage her own household, could not raise a son properly, could not maintain the standards that separated the elite from the merely wealthy. "He eats like he has earned nothing and owns nothing," Victoria would confide to her closest associates, women who shared her values and her determination to maintain appearances at any cost. "I have given him every advantage, every opportunity to become a man of substance and character, and he repays me with this grotesque display of weakness." Her friends would nod sympathetically, offering their own stories of disappointing children and the measures they had taken to correct behavioral problems. These conversations happened in parlors decorated with flowers picked by enslaved hands, over tea served by women who had no choice in their servitude, among people who saw no contradiction between their professed Christianity and their absolute ownership of other human beings. What Victoria could not or would not see was that Thomas's eating, had become his only form of control in a life where every other aspect was managed by his mother. He could not choose his education, his activities, his friends, or his future, but he could choose what he put in his mouth, and that small rebellion had grown into the one thing about himself that truly belonged to him. Food became comfort in a house that offered none. It became defiance in a world where direct defiance would be crushed immediately. It became the physical manifestation of grief for a father he had loved and lost, a father whose final letter to Thomas, burned by Victoria before it could be read, had tried to explain his choice and apologize for the cowardice that made suicide seem like the only escape from complicity in evil. Victoria had tried conventional methods first. She had hired tutors to instruct Thomas in proper dietary habits. She had arranged for riding lessons, fencing instruction, and supervised exercise programs. She had restricted his access to the kitchen and monitored every meal. But Thomas found ways around every restriction. The enslaved people who worked in the house, sympathetic to a lonely boy, would slip him food. He would eat in secret, hoarding supplies in his room. The more Victoria tried to control him, the more his weight increased, as if his body itself was rebelling against her authority. By the winter of 1838, Victoria's frustration had transformed into something darker and more determined. Conventional methods had failed. Social pressure had failed. Reason and persuasion had failed. She began to consider approaches that other mothers whispered about in private, methods that required isolation and absolute control, transformations that happened away from public scrutiny, where the messiness of the process would never be witnessed or questioned by those whose opinions mattered. The Harrington Plantation operated with the brutal efficiency that Victoria demanded in all things. 312 enslaved people worked the cotton fields, the house, the stables, the gardens, and the various outbuildings that kept the estate functioning. The system ran on violence, both explicit and implied. Overseers carried whips they did not hesitate to use. Families were separated when it served economic purposes. Children were sold away from parents when buyers offered good prices. This was the world Victoria had inherited and maintained without question or apparent conscience. Within this system, certain individuals acquired specialized roles based on skills that made them particularly valuable to the plantation's operations. Ruth was one such person. At 34 years old, she had been born on Belmont Plantation and trained from childhood in the complex skills of household management and herbal medicine. Her mother had been the plantation's primary healer, possessing knowledge passed down through generations about which plants could cure illness, which could ease pain, and which, in the wrong doses, could kill. Ruth had learned everything her mother knew, and she had expanded that knowledge through careful observation and secret experimentation. She understood the human body in ways that most formally trained physicians of the era did not. She knew which herbs could purge the stomach violently. She knew which tinctures could suppress appetite so completely that food became repulsive. She knew which methods of physical exertion could transform flesh when applied with sufficient rigor and duration. She knew, in short, how to break a body down and rebuild it according to someone else's specifications. Victoria had been watching Ruth for months, observing how she managed the health of the enslaved population with remarkable effectiveness. When workers fell ill, Ruth could usually restore them to functionality within days. When injuries occurred, she could treat them with poultices and tinctures that prevented infection and promoted healing. Most impressively to Victoria, Ruth could keep people working even when they should have collapsed from exhaustion, using carefully calibrated combinations of stimulants and pain suppressants that extracted maximum productivity from bodies that were already being pushed beyond sustainable limits. This was exactly the kind of knowledge Victoria needed for what she had begun to plan. The idea had come from Mrs. Helena Blackwood during a garden party in March of 1839. Helena's son Richard had been, in her words, disappointingly soft and bookish, more interested in poetry than plantation management. Helena had solved this problem by isolating Richard in a structure on her property and placing him under the supervision of an enslaved man who had previously worked as an overseer. The regimen had been intensive. Dawn to dusk, physical labor, minimal food, absolute isolation from anyone who might show sympathy or offer comfort. The results were remarkable. Helena confided to Victoria and 2 other trusted friends. Within 4 months, Richard had lost his excess weight and developed the physical strength that had been lacking. More importantly, his will had been properly subdued. He no longer questioned my decisions or indulged in inappropriate sentimentality. The treatment broke him down and rebuilt him into something far more suitable. Victoria listened with intense interest, asking detailed questions about methods and outcomes. How much food was provided? What types of labor were most effective? How was isolation maintained? What happened if the subject resisted or refused to cooperate? Helena answered each question with clinical detachment, as if discussing the training of a horse rather than the treatment of her own child. The other women in the conversation contributed their own observations and suggestions. Mrs. Caroline Whitfield mentioned that her brother's family had used similar methods with a daughter who had refused to conform to proper feminine behavior. Mrs. Margaret Carlyle noted that complete isolation was essential, that any outside contact could undermine the process by providing emotional support that would help the subject maintain resistance. By the end of that conversation, Victoria had made her decision. Thomas would undergo transformation. He would be isolated in a structure she controlled, placed under the supervision of someone who possessed both the knowledge to manage the physical aspects of the regimen and the vulnerability to ensure complete obedience to Victoria's instructions. Ruth was the obvious choice. She had the skills. She had no legal rights or protections. She could be threatened into compliance and discarded if she failed. Most importantly, she would understand that any deviation from instructions would result in consequences extending beyond herself to her family members who also lived and worked on Belmont. The carriage house at the eastern edge of Belmont Plantation stood isolated from the main property by a dense grove of magnolias and live oaks whose branches created a canopy so thick that the building remained in perpetual shadow even at midday. Built in 1820 as a combination storage facility and workshop, by 1839 it had been largely abandoned in favor of newer structures closer to the cotton fields and the river landing, where crops were loaded onto boats. The building was massive, nearly 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with thick brick walls that had been constructed to withstand both weather and time. Its windows were small and placed high on the walls, designed originally to provide ventilation, while preventing theft of valuable equipment stored inside. The upper level had once housed tools and seasonal supplies, while the lower level had served as a workshop where repairs could be made during winter months when fieldwork slowed. Victoria had ordered the building cleaned and refurbished in March of 1839, though she told no one outside her most trusted household staff the true purpose of the renovation. Workers were instructed to scrub every surface until decades of dust and accumulated debris had been removed. The windows were fitted with heavy shutters that could be barred from the outside. A strong lock was installed on the main door, and Victoria kept the only key on a chain she wore constantly around her neck. Inside, she had specific furnishings installed according to her detailed instructions. A narrow sleeping pallet was placed in one corner, stuffed with straw and covered with a single rough blanket. A work table occupied the center of the space, its surface scarred from years of use, but still sturdy. Along one wall, she had various implements arranged: axes for splitting firewood, saws for cutting lumber, hammers and other tools that could serve dual purposes as both equipment for labor and instruments of discipline if necessary. The isolation of the building was perfect for Victoria's purposes. It could not be seen from the mansion's windows, blocked by the grove of trees and the natural terrain that dipped slightly in that direction. Sound did not carry well from that location. The thick walls and the distance from other structures meant that screams, if there were screams, would not reach the main house or the slave quarters. Whatever happened in that carriage house could happen without witness, without documentation, without anyone outside Victoria's immediate control ever knowing the truth of what occurred within those brick walls. She had thought through every detail with the same meticulous attention she brought to all her projects. The location ensured privacy. The structure ensured security. The isolation ensured that Thomas would have no one to appeal to, no one to offer comfort, no one to bear witness to his suffering except the person Victoria had chosen to inflict it. Victoria visited the carriage house frequently during the renovation, inspecting every detail to ensure it met her specifications. She stood in the empty space and imagined how it would function. Thomas would sleep on the pallet, uncomfortable enough to prevent restful sleep, but adequate to sustain life. He would work at the table and with the tools, engaging in labor intensive enough to burn away his excess weight, but not so dangerous that he might injure himself in ways that would raise questions. He would be completely cut off from the life he had known, isolated from books and comfort and any human connection that might reinforce his resistance to the transformation Victoria intended to impose. The carriage house would become a world unto itself, a place where normal rules did not apply, where a mother's absolute authority over her child could be exercised without the constraints of social observation or legal limitation. She also made arrangements for supplies to be delivered to the building without drawing attention. A small store of food would be kept locked in a cabinet to which only Victoria and Ruth would have access. Water could be drawn from a well located approximately 50 yards from the building. Firewood for heating could be gathered from the surrounding woods. Everything necessary for survival was available, but nothing that would provide comfort or pleasure. This was not meant to be a home or even a prison in the conventional sense. It was meant to be a crucible, a place where one version of Thomas Harrington would be destroyed so that another, more acceptable version could be created in his place. The final preparation Victoria made was to ensure that the household staff understood their roles and their obligations to silence. She gathered the key servants and explained in terms that left no room for misunderstanding that Thomas was undergoing a special treatment for his health, that no one was to discuss it outside the plantation, and that anyone who failed to maintain absolute discretion would face consequences that would extend to their families. The threat was clear. Victoria's power was absolute within the boundaries of Belmont. She could sell, separate, or punish anyone who displeased her. The conspiracy of silence she demanded was guaranteed by fear. On April 3, 1839, Victoria summoned Ruth to the main house. The summons came in the early evening, after the day's work had concluded, but before the enslaved population had retired to their quarters. It was unusual for someone in Ruth's position to be brought into the formal parlor, where Victoria entertained guests and conducted the business of the plantation. Ruth understood immediately that this meeting carried significance beyond normal household instructions. She entered through the rear door as required, was directed by a house servant to remove her work shoes, and was then led into Victoria's presence with instructions to stand and wait. Victoria sat in a high-back chair positioned to catch the last light of day through the tall windows. Her posture was perfect, her dress immaculate, her hands folded in her lap in a pose of complete composure. She did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to extend until Ruth felt the weight of it, the implicit reminder of who held power in this room and in every interaction that occurred on Belmont Plantation. Finally, Victoria looked up and met Ruth's eyes with an expression that combined calculation and cold determination. "I have a task for you," Victoria began, her voice carrying the false warmth she used when giving orders she expected to be obeyed without question or hesitation. "My son Thomas requires rehabilitation. He has become weak and indolent, unsuited for the responsibilities that will one day befall him as master of this estate. His body has become excessive, a sign of moral weakness and lack of discipline that must be corrected before he can take his place in society. You will oversee his transformation." Ruth felt ice settle in her stomach. She had heard rumors over the past weeks about the carriage house being renovated, about private conversations between Victoria and other plantation mistresses, about young men from neighboring estates who had disappeared from social gatherings. She had not wanted to believe that Victoria would apply such methods to her own son, but now the truth was undeniable. "What kind of transformation, ma'am?" Ruth asked carefully, knowing that her tone had to convey respect and submission, while her mind raced through the implications of what was being asked of her. Victoria's smile was cold and precise, the kind that turns weakness into strength, excess into discipline, disobedience into proper submission. "You will take him to the carriage house. You will design a regimen of labor and dietary restriction that will burn away his corpulence and reveal the man he should be. You will have complete authority over his daily activities, his food, his rest, everything. I expect results within 6 months. He is to lose at least 80 pounds. More importantly, his will is to be properly subdued. When he returns to this house, he will be obedient, disciplined, and suitable to be presented in society as my son and heir." Ruth wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed that what Victoria was proposing was wrong, that no mother should treat her child this way, that she was being asked to participate in torture. But Ruth also understood the reality of her situation with perfect clarity. She had no legal right to refuse. She had no protection under law. If she expressed reluctance or resistance, Victoria would simply choose someone else, and Ruth would face punishment for her disobedience. Worse, Victoria might extend that punishment to Ruth's 2 daughters who worked in the main house, or to Ruth's elderly mother who lived in the quarters and depended on Ruth's status for slightly better treatment than field workers received. "I understand, ma'am," Ruth said quietly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "What authority will I have to discipline him if he refuses to cooperate?" She needed to understand the full extent of what she was being asked to do, how far Victoria expected her to go in imposing this transformation. Victoria's expression did not change. Whatever authority is necessary. You may restrict his food further if he proves difficult. You may extend his labor hours. You may discipline him physically if required, though I prefer methods that do not leave permanent marks. My son needs to learn that resistance is futile and that obedience is his only path to ending his discomfort. I trust I do not need to specify what will happen if you fail in this task. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but perfectly understood. Ruth's value to Victoria depended on her success. Failure would mean she was no longer useful, and people who were not useful on plantations like Belmont did not remain there long. They were sold to places where labor was even more brutal, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. Ruth thought of her daughters, of her mother, of the small community of people she loved and was responsible for protecting. She thought of Thomas, a boy she had watched grow up, who had always been kind to the enslaved people he encountered, who had never participated in the cruelties that other plantation children practiced for entertainment. "I will do as you require, ma'am," Ruth finally said, sealing both her fate and Thomas's with those words. On the morning of April 4th, 1839, he was awakened before dawn by two enslaved men who entered his bedroom without knocking. Marcus and James, both field supervisors who understood the cost of disobedience, had been given their instructions the previous evening. They were to bring Thomas to the carriage house, using force if necessary, but preferably with enough cooperation that no visible injuries would result. Thomas, confused and still half asleep, initially thought there had been some emergency that required his immediate attention. "What is happening?" he asked, pulling on a robe over his nightclothes. "Is there a fire? Has something happened to my mother?" Marcus, whose face showed the strain of what he had been ordered to do, shook his head but did not answer. "You need to come with us, Master Thomas. Your mother's orders." The use of his title felt like mockery given the circumstances, but Marcus maintained the required formality even as he participated in what he knew was fundamentally wrong. They led Thomas through the house and out into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was cool and heavy with moisture, and Thomas's bare feet quickly became wet from the dew-soaked grass. He was still in his nightclothes, a detail that added to his growing sense that something was profoundly wrong with this situation. "Where are we going?" he demanded, his voice rising with fear and confusion. "I want to speak to my mother immediately." But James, walking behind him, simply placed a firm hand on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture that communicated both guidance and compulsion. They walked across the grounds toward the eastern edge of the property, following a path Thomas rarely traveled. As they approached the grove of magnolias and live oaks, Thomas saw the carriage house ahead and a figure waiting at its door. Ruth stood in the shadows, her expression carefully neutral, her posture rigid with the tension of what she had been forced to accept. When Thomas saw her, recognition dawned with horrifying clarity. This was not an emergency. This was something his mother had planned, something that involved his removal from the house and his placement in Ruth's custody. "No," Thomas said, stopping abruptly and trying to pull away from the men who flanked him. "I will not go in there. Take me back to the house. I demand to speak with my mother." But Marcus and James had their orders, and disobedience would cost them more than it would cost Thomas. They gripped his arms more firmly and moved him forward despite his resistance. His protests grew louder, his fear more evident, but there was no one to hear him except the people who had no power to help. Ruth watched Thomas's approach with a complicated mixture of emotions she could not afford to show on her face. She saw the fear in his eyes, the dawning understanding that his life had changed in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. When Marcus and James delivered him to the threshold of the carriage house, Ruth stepped forward and met Thomas's gaze directly. "What is happening?" Thomas asked her, his voice breaking slightly. "Where's my mother? Why am I being brought here?" Ruth chose her words carefully, knowing that everything she said would matter, that this first conversation would set the tone for everything that followed. "Your mother has given you to me for rehabilitation," she said quietly. "I am to oversee your transformation. She believes you need discipline and physical improvement. I am to provide both." Thomas's face went pale as the full reality of his situation became clear. He looked at the carriage house behind Ruth, at the barred windows and heavy door, and understood that this was not a temporary arrangement. This was imprisonment. "For how long?" he whispered. Ruth did not answer because she did not know. Victoria had given no specific timeline, only results she expected to see. And Ruth understood that the duration would depend entirely on how quickly Thomas's body and will conformed to his mother's demands. The regimen Ruth designed was brutal because Victoria demanded brutality, but it was also calculated to keep Thomas alive long enough to achieve the transformation his mother required. Ruth had seen what happened when labor was imposed without regard for human limits. She had watched people work themselves to death in cotton fields, had treated injuries that never healed properly, had prepared bodies for burial when overseers pushed too hard. She did not want Thomas to die, both because she possessed basic human compassion and because his death would mean her own punishment. She had to find a terrible balance between cruelty that would satisfy Victoria and restraint that would preserve Thomas's life. Thomas would wake at dawn, roused by Ruth's knock on the door. His sleeping pallet was deliberately uncomfortable, stuffed with straw that compacted and created uneven surfaces that prevented deep rest. The single blanket provided was insufficient for the cool spring nights, ensuring he slept poorly and woke exhausted. His first task each morning was to split firewood. Ruth had arranged for logs to be delivered to the carriage house in quantities that seemed endless. Thomas, who had never performed manual labor in his life, struggled with the unfamiliar weight of the axe and the technique required to split wood efficiently. His hands, soft from a life of leisure, developed blisters within the first hour that burst and bled as he continued working. After 2 hours of splitting wood, Thomas was required to haul water from a well located 50 yards from the carriage house. He carried 2 wooden buckets, each holding approximately 3 gallons, making trip after trip to fill large barrels that Ruth had positioned inside the building. The water was supposedly for various purposes, but Ruth knew the real purpose was exhaustion. The buckets were heavy, the path was uneven, and Thomas's body was not conditioned for such repetitive physical strain. He stumbled frequently, spilling water and requiring additional trips to complete his assigned quota. At midday, Thomas was given his only break of more than a few minutes. He was allowed to sit, to drink a small amount of water, and to eat if food was provided. But the food rations were minimal and carefully calculated. 1 bowl of thin corn mush in the morning, barely enough to provide energy for the labor demanded. 1 cup of water at the midday break, insufficient to fully replace what he lost through sweat and exertion. 1 small portion of beans and cornbread in the evening, enough to prevent starvation, but not enough to maintain his current body weight, under conditions of intense physical labor. Ruth measured everything precisely, following Victoria's instructions, but also trying to ensure Thomas received the absolute minimum necessary for survival. The afternoon labor was even more demanding than the morning. Thomas was required to grind corn using a manual stone mill, pushing a heavy lever in circles for hours until his shoulders and back screamed with pain. Or he would carry 50-pound sacks of grain from one end of the carriage house to the other in endless repetition, a task that served no practical purpose except to exhaust him. Sometimes Ruth varied the regimen, having him dig holes and then fill them in, or move piles of stones from one location to another, and then back again. The work was designed not for productivity but for the breaking of will through pointless, endless physical suffering. Ruth watched Thomas struggle through those first days with emotions she could not fully process. She was being forced to torture this boy who had never done anything to deserve such treatment. Yet she also understood that her own survival and the safety of her family depended on her compliance with Victoria's orders. She found herself trying to offer small mercies where she could without risking Victoria's anger. When Thomas's hands bled, she provided rags to wrap them. When he collapsed from exhaustion, she allowed him a few extra minutes of rest before forcing him to resume work. When his form on a task was so poor that he risked serious injury, she would quietly correct his technique. Something unexpected happened in those first weeks of Thomas's captivity. Despite the brutality of the regimen and the fundamental wrongness of their situation, Thomas and Ruth began to talk to each other as human beings rather than as master and enslaved person or as prisoner and jailer. Initially, their conversations were brief and entirely functional. Thomas would ask for water. Ruth would provide it with a carefully measured response. He would stumble from exhaustion. She would help him rise without comment. But gradually, in the quiet moments between tasks, when Thomas sat recovering from one bout of labor before beginning another, they began to speak of deeper things that mattered. Thomas talked about his father. He described Jonathan Harrington as a man who had grown increasingly troubled by the institution of slavery as he aged, who had spent his final years reading abolitionist literature in secret and struggling with the moral weight of owning other human beings. "He changed," Thomas said one afternoon as he rested against the wall of the carriage house, his body trembling from fatigue. "When I was younger, he seemed content with how things were. But something shifted. He started looking at the people who worked our land differently, started questioning things he had always accepted. My mother hated it. She said he was becoming weak and sentimental." Ruth listened carefully, understanding that Thomas was sharing information that could be dangerous if repeated, but also recognizing the need in his voice for someone to bear witness to his father's transformation. "Did he ever speak to you about what troubled him?" she asked quietly, maintaining the pretense of working even as they talked, knowing that Victoria might appear at any moment for an inspection. Thomas nodded. "He told me once that every person has worth regardless of the color of their skin or their station in life. He said that slavery was a sin that would eventually destroy the South from within, that we were building our prosperity on a foundation of evil that could not stand forever." My mother overheard part of that conversation. They argued for hours afterward. She told him he was being foolish and dangerous, that such ideas would destroy our family and our position in society. Thomas's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I think that argument was one of the things that pushed him toward his final choice. Ruth felt something shift in how she perceived this boy. She had assumed he would be like other plantation heirs, raised to see enslaved people as property rather than humans, trained to take his place in a system built on brutality. But Thomas had been exposed to different ideas, had witnessed his father's moral struggle, and had at least begun to question the world he had been born into. "Your father sounds like he was trying to find his way to something better," Ruth said carefully. "That takes courage, even if he could not follow through." Thomas looked at her directly, and in that moment, the careful distance they had been maintaining collapsed slightly. "I am sorry," he said suddenly. "I am sorry for what my family has done to you, and to everyone else here. I am sorry that you are being forced to do this to me. I know you have no choice. I know my mother has threatened you." The words tumbled out quickly, as if he had been holding them back and could no longer contain them. Ruth felt tears prick at her eyes, but could not allow them to fall. Showing emotion would be dangerous, would suggest a connection that could be used against both of them. "Your apology does not change our circumstances," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "But I appreciate hearing it nonetheless. You are not responsible for the sins of your family, Thomas. You are just a boy trapped in a system neither of us chose." From that conversation forward, something had changed between them. They were still prisoner and jailer, still separated by enormous differences in power and circumstance. But they were also two people who had begun to see each other's humanity, and that recognition would reshape everything that followed. Transformation through suffering. By early June, after 8 weeks of relentless labor and severe dietary restriction, Thomas's body had begun to change in ways that were both remarkable and deeply troubling. The constant physical exertion and minimal food intake were having their intended effect on his weight. He had dropped from approximately 280 pounds to somewhere around 240, a loss of 40 pounds that showed dramatically on his frame. His face, once round and full, now revealed the sharp edges of cheekbones and jawline. His arms, which had carried soft flesh, now showed the beginnings of muscle definition alongside prominent veins. His hands, once soft and uncalloused, were now covered in thick layers of hardened skin, permanent scars from blisters that had burst and healed and formed again. But the transformation was not what Victoria had envisioned when she designed this program. Thomas was not becoming strong in the way she had intended. He was not developing the vigorous, commanding presence that characterized successful plantation heirs. Instead, he was becoming hollowed out, consumed from within by the brutal demands being placed on his body without adequate nutrition to sustain both the labor and basic health. Ruth watched this deterioration with growing alarm, recognizing signs she had seen before in enslaved people who were being worked to death. Thomas's eyes, which had initially shown fear and confusion, now held a vacant quality that suggested something fundamental was breaking inside him. His movements had become mechanical and devoid of personality or will. He worked because stopping meant punishment. He ate his meager rations because instinct demanded survival. But the person Thomas had been, the thoughtful boy who read books and questioned the world around him, was disappearing day by day. Ruth tried to supplement his diet in small ways that would not be detected by Victoria during her periodic inspections. She would occasionally share a portion of her own food with him, slipping him an extra piece of cornbread or a handful of dried fruit when she was certain no one was watching. But it was never enough to counteract the caloric deficit created by the combination of hard labor and starvation rations. Thomas's body was consuming itself, burning muscle along with fat, breaking down tissues to provide energy that food should have supplied. He developed a persistent cough that worried Ruth deeply. His skin took on a grayish pallor. His hair, once thick and healthy, became brittle and began to thin noticeably. Victoria visited the carriage house every few days to inspect Thomas's progress and to ensure Ruth was following instructions properly. During these visits, she would circle her son like a buyer examining livestock, noting changes in his appearance with clinical detachment. "The excess is beginning to melt away," she observed with satisfaction during one visit in mid-June. "His face is losing that bloated quality. His body is becoming more acceptable." She never asked how Thomas felt, never inquired about his health beyond its visible manifestations, never showed any maternal concern for his well-being. She saw only the physical transformation, not the psychological and physiological damage being inflicted. Thomas had stopped speaking unless directly questioned. He no longer complained about the work or pleaded for better food or asked when this ordeal would end. He simply existed, moving through each day with the same dead-eyed compliance that Ruth had seen in people who had given up hope. This worried Ruth more than his initial resistance had. A person who fought back, who maintained anger or defiance, still possessed spirit that might sustain them. But Thomas was disappearing into himself, retreating to some inner place where the pain and exhaustion could not fully reach him. Ruth recognized this as a survival mechanism, but she also knew it was a dangerous one. People who retreated too far sometimes did not come back. Victoria's success with Thomas, at least as she measured success through the visible reduction in his weight, did not go unnoticed among her social circle. By midsummer, other plantation mistresses were visiting Belmont under various pretenses, but their true purpose was always the same. They wanted to see the results of Victoria's methods and to learn how they might apply similar approaches to their own disappointing sons. These visits followed a careful pattern. The women would arrive for afternoon tea, would engage in the usual social pleasantries expected among the elite, and then, as if the thought had just occurred to them, would ask to see the grounds or inspect some improvement Victoria had mentioned. These tours inevitably included a walk past the carriage house, where Thomas could be observed through a window or sometimes even brought out briefly for inspection. Mrs. Helena Blackwood was among the first to express direct interest in Victoria's methods. Her son Richard, now 18, had proven disappointing in ways that embarrassed Helena socially. He had refused multiple opportunities to duel men who had insulted the family, claiming that violence solved nothing. He wrote poetry in secret, verses that Helena had discovered and found disturbingly emotional and weak. He had been caught reading abolitionist newspapers smuggled from the North. "I need to correct his thinking before he becomes a complete embarrassment," Helena confided to Victoria during one visit. "Your methods seem to have produced remarkable results. Thomas looks completely transformed from the boy he was." Victoria, pleased by the recognition and the opportunity to position herself as an expert in this new form of domestic management, shared detailed information about her approach. She described the importance of isolation, the calculation of food rations, the types of labor most effective at producing physical transformation. She spoke with the confidence of someone discussing agricultural techniques or household management, never acknowledging the cruelty inherent in what she was describing. Mrs. Caroline Whitfield soon followed with her own concerns about her son James. At 19, James had developed what Caroline considered an inappropriate interest in the plantation's financial affairs. He had been asking questions about profit margins, about the costs of maintaining enslaved labor, about alternative economic models he had read about in northern publications. "He needs to understand his place," Caroline said firmly. "He is not meant to question the system his father built. He is meant to inherit it and maintain it exactly as it has always been." She looked at Victoria with desperate hope. "Can your methods address problems of this nature? Can they teach obedience along with physical discipline?" Victoria assured her that the treatment worked on both body and mind, that the combination of isolation, physical exhaustion, and absolute control over every aspect of daily life would break down resistance and rebuild the subject according to the specifications provided. By August, arrangements had been made for Richard Blackwood to begin his own transformation at his family's estate. By September, James Whitfield had been quietly removed from social circulation and placed in an isolated structure on the Whitfield plantation. Other families followed. Each mother adapted the basic approach to her specific situation and concerns. But the core remained the same: isolation, brutal physical labor, starvation rations, and absolute control maintained through the forced participation of enslaved people who had no choice but to comply with orders, no matter how morally repugnant they found them. What none of these mothers anticipated, or perhaps cared about, was the creation of a network of enslaved people who were being forced to witness and participate in these atrocities. The men and women assigned to supervise these transformations began to communicate with each other through the informal channels that existed between plantations. They shared information about methods being used, about the condition of the young men in their custody, about the mothers who ordered such cruelty against their own children. Ruth had been granted unusual mobility for an enslaved woman, a circumstance that arose from her unique position as supervisor of Thomas's transformation and her specialized knowledge of herbal medicine. Victoria occasionally sent her to neighboring plantations to deliver messages, to consult with other enslaved people who were managing similar rehabilitation programs, or to gather information about methods being employed elsewhere. These trips, always carefully supervised and limited in duration, nevertheless provided Ruth with glimpses into what was happening across Wilcox County, and what she discovered horrified her in ways that went beyond even her own complicity in Thomas's suffering. During a visit to the Blackwood estate in late August, Ruth made a discovery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had been sent to consult with Marcus, an enslaved overseer who had been placed in charge of Richard Blackwood's transformation. Mrs. Blackwood wanted to compare progress and methods to ensure that her approach aligned with the successful template Victoria had established. Ruth arrived at the Blackwood plantation in mid-afternoon, escorted by one of Belmont's workers who would wait to return her before nightfall. She was directed to the structure where Richard had been held, a converted tobacco barn located at the far edge of the cultivated fields. As Ruth approached the barn, she immediately sensed something was wrong. The building was surrounded by activity that seemed frantic and purposeful. 4 enslaved workers were carrying buckets of water and scrub brushes, moving in and out of the structure with expressions that carefully revealed nothing. The smell that drifted from the open door was one Ruth recognized instantly from her years of medical work. It was the smell of death, of flesh left too long before burial, of bodily fluids that had soaked into wood and could never be fully removed, no matter how much scrubbing occurred. She stopped walking, her stomach turning over, and one of the workers noticed her presence. "You cannot go in there," the woman said quickly, positioning herself to block Ruth's path. "Mrs. Blackwood's orders. No one is to enter until cleaning is complete." Ruth met the woman's eyes and saw fear there, and grief, and the terrible knowledge of someone who had witnessed something she wished she had not. "Where is Richard?" Ruth asked quietly. "Where is Marcus? I was sent to consult with him about the rehabilitation program." The woman's expression hardened slightly. "Richard Blackwood was sent to a military academy in Virginia 3 days ago. Marcus was sold yesterday to a cotton factor heading to Louisiana. Mrs. Blackwood said he failed in his duties and was no longer suitable for work on this plantation." The words were delivered in a flat tone that suggested they had been rehearsed, that this was the official story everyone on the Blackwood estate had been instructed to tell. But Ruth heard what was not being said. Richard had not been sent away. He was dead. And Marcus, who had been forced to oversee his deterioration, had been removed to ensure his silence. Ruth did not push further in that moment. She understood that asking more questions would endanger both herself and the people she was speaking with. She delivered the message Victoria had sent, accepted some herbs that Mrs. Blackwood had requested in trade, and returned to Belmont with a growing sense of dread. That night, unable to sleep, Ruth thought about the implications of what she had discovered. If Richard Blackwood was dead, how many others had suffered the same fate? She began to ask careful questions during subsequent visits to other plantations, gathering information in ways that would not raise suspicion. The pattern that emerged was chilling. At least 3 young men who had undergone these transformations had vanished completely from records. Their families claimed they had been sent to schools or relatives in distant states, but there were no letters, no continued contact, no evidence they had actually departed for these supposed destinations. By September, Thomas had been imprisoned in the carriage house for 5 months. His weight had dropped to approximately 185 pounds, a loss of nearly 100 pounds from his starting point, and he was no longer recognizable as the boy he had been. His physical transformation had exceeded even Victoria's expectations, but it had come at a cost Ruth found increasingly unbearable. Thomas moved through each day like a ghost, performing his assigned labor with mechanical precision, but showing no emotion, no personality, no spark of the person he had once been. He rarely spoke. He no longer asked questions about when his ordeal would end. He simply existed, and Ruth understood that she was watching a human being be slowly destroyed. But something else had been happening during those 5 months that Victoria knew nothing about. Ruth had been documenting everything in a journal she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the carriage house. Using literacy she had acquired secretly years ago, taught by a sympathetic tutor who had briefly worked on the plantation before being dismissed for inappropriate kindness toward enslaved people. Ruth had been recording dates, methods, observations, and conversations. She wrote about Thomas's physical deterioration, noting each significant change in his health. She wrote about her own forced participation in his torture, documenting the specific orders Victoria had given, and Ruth's attempts to mitigate the cruelty where possible. She wrote about the visits from other plantation mistresses and the establishment of similar programs across the county. Most importantly, Ruth wrote about the young men who had disappeared. She recorded names, dates, and the circumstances of their vanishing. Richard Blackwood, who had supposedly been sent to military school, but whose transformation barn had been scrubbed clean of evidence. James Whitfield, whose mother claimed he was studying with relatives in Charleston, but who had never actually departed the plantation, according to enslaved workers Ruth had spoken with. William Carlyle, who had allegedly traveled to Europe for education, but whose passport had never been processed according to a house servant who managed the family's correspondence. Ruth documented everything she could learn, creating a record that would prove what these families had done if anyone with authority ever chose to investigate. She knew that keeping this journal was risking her life and the lives of her family members. If Victoria discovered it, the consequences would be immediate and brutal. Ruth would almost certainly be killed, and her daughters and elderly mother would be sold to the worst possible situations as additional punishment. But Ruth had reached a point where silence felt like a greater sin than the risk of exposure. She had been forced to torture Thomas, to watch him waste away, to participate in a system of cruelty that extended across multiple families and had already claimed lives. She could not stop what was happening, could not refuse Victoria's orders, could not save Thomas through direct action, but she could ensure that what was occurring would not be completely erased from history. Each night, after Thomas had collapsed onto his pallet in exhausted sleep, Ruth would retrieve her journal and add new observations by the light of a carefully shielded candle. She wrote about Thomas's deteriorating health, about the cough that had become persistent and concerning, about the way his eyes had lost focus and his hands trembled constantly from malnutrition. She wrote about her own emotional state, about the guilt that consumed her and the helplessness she felt. She wrote about conversations she had overheard between plantation mistresses, about their casual discussion of sons as problems to be solved, rather than human beings to be loved. The journal became Ruth's act of resistance, the one thing she could do that might eventually matter, that might someday serve as testimony to the truth of what had happened in these isolated buildings across Wilcox County during the summer and fall of 1839. In late September, Victoria made one of her increasingly rare visits to the carriage house. Her inspections had become less frequent as Thomas's transformation progressed, partly because she was satisfied with the visible results, and partly because even she seemed uncomfortable with prolonged exposure to what she had created. She arrived in mid-afternoon, accompanied by Dr. Harrison, the physician who served the plantation families and could be relied upon to provide whatever medical opinions his wealthy clients required. Victoria wanted a professional assessment of Thomas's condition, documentation that the treatment had been successful, and that her son was now fit to be gradually reintegrated into society. Victoria entered the carriage house and found Thomas splitting firewood, a task he performed with the same mechanical efficiency he brought to all his labor. She circled him slowly, examining his transformed body with an expression of satisfaction. He had lost the excess weight she had found so shameful. His frame, though gaunt and showing signs of malnutrition that Dr. Harrison noted with concern, nevertheless displayed the lean physique she had demanded. His face, stripped of its former fullness, showed the bone structure she considered more acceptable. "You are beginning to resemble a proper man," Victoria said, her voice carrying approval for perhaps the first time in Thomas's memory. "Perhaps another month or two of maintenance regimen, and you will be fit to be seen in society." We shall have to acquire new clothing, of course. Nothing you owned before will fit your improved form. Thomas, who had been silent through most of Victoria's recent inspections, who had learned that speaking only invited longer visits and more detailed critiques, finally broke his months of near silence. He set down the axe carefully, turned to face his mother directly, and spoke with a clarity that surprised even Ruth. "I know what you are doing," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse but steady with certainty. "This is not rehabilitation. This is not improvement or correction. This is punishment. You are punishing me for not being the son you wanted, for being an embarrassment to you, for failing to meet your impossible standards." Victoria's expression remained cold, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been surprise at Thomas's sudden willingness to speak truth. "I am correcting a defect," she replied, with the same clinical detachment she had maintained throughout this process. "You were weak, undisciplined, unsuitable for the role you will need to fill. I have made you better. You should be grateful that I cared enough to undertake this correction, rather than simply accepting your failure." Thomas laughed, a sound that held no humor, only bitter recognition of absurdity. "No. When this is complete, I will be dead, like Richard Blackwood, like James Whitfield, like the others whose names I have heard whispered. You are killing us because we embarrass you, because we do not conform to your vision of perfection, and you cannot bear that we exist as evidence that you are not in complete control of your world." For the first time, Victoria's certainty wavered visibly. Her face paled slightly, and her hands, which had been relaxed at her sides, clenched into fists. "How do you know about the others?" she asked, her voice sharp with something that might have been fear. Ruth, standing in the corner where she had been instructed to remain during Victoria's visits, felt ice flood through her veins. Thomas had just revealed knowledge he should not possess, information that could only have come from conversations with Ruth or from overhearing things discussed by the workers who delivered supplies. Thomas met his mother's eyes without flinching. "Did you think you could hide it? Did you think enslaved people do not talk to each other, do not share information, do not know what happens on neighboring plantations? Everyone knows, Mother. They know what you and the other families are doing. They know about the boys who disappear. They know this is murder dressed up as maternal concern." That night, after Victoria had departed with Dr. Harrison and her obvious discomfort at Thomas's accusations, Ruth and Thomas spoke in urgent whispers that carried the weight of desperation. Thomas's willingness to confront his mother had changed something fundamental in their situation. He had broken the silence that Victoria depended on, had named the truth of what was occurring, and in doing so, had made himself significantly more dangerous to his mother's carefully maintained social position. Ruth understood that Thomas's confrontation had likely accelerated whatever timeline Victoria had been following. A son who remained silent and broken was manageable. A son who spoke truth and made accusations was a problem that needed to be resolved permanently. "You cannot stay here," Ruth said quietly, glancing toward the door to ensure no one was within hearing distance. "Your mother will not allow you to continue speaking as you did today. She will find a way to silence you permanently, and she will make it appear natural or unavoidable. You have perhaps maybe a week before she acts." Thomas nodded, having reached the same conclusion. "Then I need to escape." "But escape to where? I have no money, no resources, no allies outside this plantation. And you, Ruth, if I leave, my mother will blame you. she will punish you for allowing it to happen." Ruth had been thinking about this possibility for weeks, ever since her discovery at the Blackwood estate had made clear how these situations typically ended. She had been preparing, gathering small amounts of supplies, making careful observations about patrol patterns and the schedules of workers who might notice unusual activity. "I have been documenting everything in a journal," she told Thomas, making a decision to trust him completely, with information that could get her killed. "I have recorded dates, methods, conversations, everything. I also know that your father left documents that your mother has hidden, documents that would challenge her control of this plantation." Thomas's expression sharpened with interest. "My father's will," he said. "I remember him telling me once that he had made arrangements that would ensure certain things happened after his death. My mother told me the will had been probated and everything was in order, but I never saw the actual document." Ruth nodded. "According to conversations I have overheard between household staff, your mother has hidden the original will and has been operating the plantation based on forged documents. If we could find that will, if we could reach authorities who might actually investigate, we could challenge her control and expose what she has done." The plan they began to develop that night was desperate and relied on circumstances they could not fully control. Thomas would need to access the main house, something that seemed impossible given his weakened state and his mother's vigilance. Ruth would need to create an opportunity for that access, which would require manipulating household schedules and taking risks that could expose her own role. They would need money for travel, documents that would allow them to move through a society that constantly monitored the movement of enslaved people, and would find a gaunt young white man traveling with a black woman immediately suspicious. But they also had advantages that Victoria might not have fully considered. Thomas, despite his physical deterioration, was still legally white and male, possessing inherent privileges in Southern society that could be leveraged if deployed carefully. Ruth possessed knowledge of routes and contacts used by people seeking freedom. Information passed through networks that plantation owners believed they had suppressed, but which continued to function beneath the surface of daily life. Most importantly, they both possessed nothing left to lose. Thomas would die if he remained at Belmont. Ruth would eventually be discarded once Thomas's transformation was complete, or once he died and her usefulness ended. In early October, less than a week after Thomas's confrontation with his mother, Victoria summoned Dr. Harrison to Belmont for a private consultation. The physician arrived in late morning and was immediately escorted to Victoria's study, where she explained that she required his professional assessment and his discretion regarding a delicate family matter. Dr. Harrison, who had served the plantation elite for 2 decades and understood that his continued prosperity depended on providing the services his clients required, rather than the medical care his conscience might have suggested, listened carefully to what Victoria needed from him. "My son has undergone significant physical transformation over the past months," Victoria began, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone discussing a business transaction rather than her child's fate. "The treatment has been successful in reducing his excessive weight, but I have become concerned about certain aspects of his condition. He has developed a persistent cough. His color is poor. He shows signs of what I believe may be consumption or some other wasting disease." This was partially true. Thomas did exhibit these symptoms, though. They were the direct result of months of starvation and overwork, rather than any natural illness. Dr. Harrison was led to the carriage house, where he examined Thomas with professional thoroughness. He noted the dramatic weight loss, the signs of malnutrition, The persistent cough that suggested respiratory compromise, the trembling in Thomas's hands that indicated neurological stress from prolonged deprivation. When the examination was complete, Dr. Harrison returned to the main house with Victoria, and his expression was troubled in ways he tried to conceal. "Mrs. Harrington," he began carefully, choosing words that would convey medical reality without directly criticizing the treatment regimen he suspected had caused Thomas's condition. "Your son is severely malnourished. His body has been consuming its own muscle tissue for energy. The cough suggests possible pneumonia or other respiratory infection that his weakened immune system cannot effectively fight. If the current conditions continue, I believe his survival beyond another month or two is unlikely." Victoria's response revealed the calculation that had been growing in her mind since Thomas's unexpected confrontation. "And if he were to pass from this illness," she said quietly, "what would be the cause of death you would record in official documentation?" Dr. Harrison felt a chill at the question, understanding immediately what was being asked of him. He was being invited to become complicit in what was effectively murder, to provide the medical documentation that would allow Victoria to dispose of her disappointing son while maintaining her social standing and avoiding investigation. The physician hesitated, his medical training and what remained of his conscience warring with his financial dependence on families like the Harringtons. "A wasting disease," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Consumption, perhaps. Something that would explain his progressive decline and would require no further investigation. Such illnesses are common enough that no one would question the diagnosis, particularly if the patient had been kept isolated to prevent contagion." Victoria nodded with satisfaction, as if they had just concluded a routine business arrangement, rather than plotting the death of her 17-year-old son. Ruth, who had been instructed to wait outside the study door in case she was needed for questions about Thomas's daily care, heard every word of this conversation through the partially open door. Her blood turned to ice as she understood what Victoria was planning. Thomas had perhaps 2 to 4 weeks before his mother would implement whatever final steps were necessary to ensure his death appeared natural and unavoidable. Thomas still possessed one advantage that neither Victoria nor Ruth had fully considered until desperation forced creative thinking. Despite his 5 months of imprisonment and systematic abuse, he remained technically and legally the heir to Belmont Plantation. Victoria had not formally disinherited him, had not taken the legal steps necessary to completely sever his claim to the estate. This oversight created a narrow window of opportunity that might be exploited if Thomas could access certain locations within the main house. That night, approximately 3 days after Ruth had overheard Victoria's conversation with Dr. Harrison about arranging Thomas's death, Ruth helped Thomas climb through the small window of the carriage house. The window was barely large enough for his now emaciated frame, and the effort left him gasping and trembling. He was weak from months of inadequate nutrition and exhausting labor, but determination drove him forward despite his body's protests. They waited in the shadows until the plantation settled into deep quiet. Ruth had carefully observed the patterns of household staff and knew that by midnight most people would be asleep. Victoria herself typically retired early, aided by laudanum she took nightly. The window of opportunity would be narrow, perhaps 2 hours when movement might go unnoticed. Thomas led the way across the grounds, moving slowly but with purpose. His bare feet made little sound on the damp grass. Ruth followed close behind, carrying a small cloth bag containing the few supplies they had managed to gather: dried food, a knife, and Ruth's hidden journal. They reached the main house, and Thomas guided them to a side entrance he knew was sometimes left unlocked. The door opened quietly, and they slipped inside. Thomas knew exactly where they needed to go. His father's study occupied a corner room on the first floor, a space Victoria had locked after Jonathan's death and rarely entered. Thomas had learned from watching his mother where she kept important keys. A small box in her dressing room held various keys to different locks throughout the house. Accessing that box would require entering Victoria's bedroom while she slept, a risk that made Ruth's hands shake as they climbed the stairs. They moved through the darkened house with agonizing slowness, pausing at every creak of floorboards. Thomas's weakened condition made the stairs particularly challenging. He had to stop twice to catch his breath, leaning heavily against the wall while fighting waves of dizziness. Ruth stayed close, ready to support him if he collapsed. They reached the second floor, and Thomas pointed toward Victoria's bedroom door. Inside, they could hear Victoria's steady breathing, deepened by laudanum. Thomas crept to her dressing table where the key box sat. His hand shook as he lifted the lid, cringing at the small click it made. Victoria stirred but did not wake. Thomas found the key to his father's study, and they retreated as carefully as they had entered. Ruth and Thomas could not escape alone. They needed help from people who understood the routes, north, who had connections to networks that assisted those fleeing slavery, who could provide forged documents and safe houses essential for any hope of reaching authorities who might actually investigate Victoria's crimes. Ruth had been considering this problem for weeks, knowing that attempting to flee without proper support would likely result in capture within days. Marcus was 28 years old, enslaved on the neighboring Carlisle plantation, and known among the enslaved community as someone who had connections to the network facilitating escapes to northern states. He was cautious and necessarily suspicious, but he had been observing the carriage houses across Wilcox County with growing concern. Marcus had lost his younger cousin to one of these rehabilitation programs, and he wanted justice. When Ruth made contact with Marcus through carefully arranged meetings, she found him receptive but focused on extracting something valuable from the risk he would be taking. "I can provide forged travel documents," Marcus told Ruth during their second meeting in a wooded area between plantations. "I can guide you to contacts in Natchez who operate safe houses. But I need something from you in return." Ruth had anticipated this. "What do you need?" she asked directly. Marcus looked at her steadily. "I need Thomas's testimony. If you survive, if you reach authorities who might listen, he needs to tell the truth about what his mother and the other families have done. I have lost family to this. We need someone who cannot be dismissed as a lying slave to speak truth about these murders." This was the fundamental challenge. Ruth could testify to what she witnessed, but her testimony would carry no legal weight. Thomas, however, was white, male, and heir to a significant plantation. His testimony might actually prompt investigation if delivered to the right authorities. "He will testify," Ruth promised. "If we survive this, Thomas will tell everything. He hates what his mother has done. He has already confronted her directly about the murders. He will not stay silent." Marcus considered this, evaluating whether he believed Ruth's promise and whether the risk was justified. Finally, he nodded. "Then we have an arrangement. Give me 3 days to make preparations." Those 3 days passed with excruciating slowness. Ruth continued Thomas's regimen to avoid suspicion, while secretly giving him slightly larger portions to build what little strength she could. She gathered supplies in quantities too small to be noticed missing. She observed patrol patterns and worker schedules, and she waited for Marcus's signal that everything was ready, knowing that discovery at any point would mean immediate death for all of them. On October 17, 1839, 9 days after Victoria's conversation with Dr. Harrison, Ruth and Thomas attempted their desperate escape. Marcus had sent word that preparations were complete and he would meet them 3 miles from the plantation at midnight. The night they chose was moonless and overcast, providing darkness to conceal movement, but making the rough terrain treacherous to navigate. Thomas left the carriage house through the window, this time not planning to return. Ruth retrieved their hidden supplies and helped Thomas shoulder the small pack, though even its light weight strained his weakened frame. They moved slowly through wooded areas where they were less likely to be spotted. Thomas's physical condition made progress agonizingly slow. He had to stop frequently to catch his breath, his lungs burning from exertion that would have been trivial before his imprisonment. His legs trembled with fatigue after the first mile, and Ruth found herself supporting more of his weight as they continued. The 3-mile journey that should have taken an hour stretched to nearly 3 as Thomas's body fought against demands it could no longer meet. Ruth watched him struggle and felt rage at what Victoria had done. Thomas had been healthy when this began. Now he was a skeletal ghost who could barely walk 3 miles without collapsing. They reached the meeting point shortly after 2 in the morning. Marcus was waiting with a covered wagon and forged documents. He took one look at Thomas and his expression tightened. He can barely stand. Are you certain he can survive the journey to Natchez? Ruth met his eyes steadily. He will survive because the alternative is remaining here and dying within weeks. We have no choice. Marcus helped lift Thomas into the wagon where a space had been prepared with blankets. Ruth climbed in beside Thomas, and Marcus took the driver's seat. The journey was brutal. The wagon jolted over uneven ground, and every bump caused Thomas pain. He lay curled on his side, struggling to breathe, occasionally coughing in ways that sounded wet and concerning. Ruth stayed close, offering water when he could take it, wiping sweat from his fevered face. She watched dawn approach with both relief at their progress and terror about what daylight would bring. They were racing against time, against Victoria's inevitable discovery of their absence, against Thomas's failing body. By the time they reached the outskirts of Natchez, Thomas was barely conscious, and Ruth understood that even if they secured passage north, his survival was far from certain. Ruth, Thomas, and Marcus arrived in Natchez as sunrise painted the Mississippi River gold. Marcus guided them to a safe house operated by a free black carpenter named Isaiah, who had been helping people escape for years. Isaiah provided food, water, and rest while Marcus arranged passage. The forged documents identified Ruth as free woman Sarah Henderson and Thomas as her invalid brother John, traveling to Louisville while he recovered from illness. The story was plausible. Thomas's gaunt appearance supported the claim of serious illness. They purchased tickets on a steamboat called the River Queen, departing at noon, and waited while morning hours passed with agonizing slowness. By 11 o'clock, they made their way to the dock to board. They were standing in line when commotion erupted at the waterfront's far end. Victoria's carriage arrived at speed, and she emerged with commanding presence. Behind her came 3 men on horseback, including Sheriff William Bradford, and several armed plantation workers. The crowd stopped to watch this display of wealth and power. Victoria walked directly toward the River Queen's passenger line until her eyes locked onto Thomas. Her expression was controlled fury mixed with shock. She approached within feet. "Did you truly believe you could escape?" Victoria's voice was quiet, more terrifying than if she had screamed. "Did you think I would not find you?" Thomas met his mother's eyes and refused to look away. "I found Father's will. I know what you did. You stole the plantation. You forged documents. You built your empire on lies and murder." The words created ripples of shock through the crowd. Other passengers paid attention. Dock workers paused. This was not simple maternal retrieval. This was public accusation of serious crimes. Victoria's face paled, but she maintained composure. "You are ill, suffering from consumption and delirium. I am here to take you home for proper medical care." She gestured to Sheriff Bradford. "My son requires assistance returning to my custody. He is not capable of rational decisions." Ruth stepped forward and pulled out her journal, holding it where the crowd could see. "This book contains documentation of everything," she said loudly. "It details how Mrs. Victoria Harrington systematically tortured her own son through starvation, forced labor, and isolation. It also documents similar treatment of other young men across Wilcox County, whose families claimed they were sent away, but who actually died from abuse." The crowd's murmur grew louder as Ruth continued speaking, naming Richard Blackwood, James Whitfield, William Carlyle, and others who had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Ruth continued before Victoria or the sheriff could interrupt. "This journal names names, provides dates, and describes methods used by multiple plantation families to dispose of sons they found disappointing. I am not the only witness. Thomas can testify to what his mother did. Marcus can testify about his cousin. Dozens of enslaved people were forced to participate and can provide detailed testimony if anyone with actual authority investigates." The crowd's murmur grew. People looked at each other with expressions mixing shock and uncomfortable recognition. Some had heard rumors, noticed disappearing young men, chosen not to ask questions. But having patterns named explicitly made silence harder to maintain. Sheriff Bradford moved toward Ruth to seize the journal, but several men in the crowd shifted position, blocking his path without appearing confrontational. They wanted to hear more before authority shut down the conversation. Victoria realized she was losing control. Her reputation, her authority, her social position all depended on certain truths remaining unspoken. But Ruth had cracked that wall open. "This woman is a slave who stole my property and kidnapped my son," Victoria said, voice rising. "Nothing she says has legal validity. Sheriff, arrest her immediately." Before Bradford could act, another voice cut through the tension. A man pushed forward from the crowd. "I am Robert Harrison, correspondent for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society and the Philadelphia Inquirer. I have been traveling through Mississippi documenting conditions. I arrived in Natchez 2 days ago and have witnessed everything said here. I can confirm I have heard similar rumors about young men from prominent families who disappeared under suspicious circumstances." The presence of a northern journalist changed everything. Victoria's face went rigid with fury and fear. Sheriff Bradford hesitated, aware that arresting people before a reporter who would publish accounts in northern newspapers might create unmanageable complications. Other crowd members began speaking up, sharing fragments of information, observations, questions they had been afraid to ask. The conspiracy of silence protecting Victoria and other families began fracturing. Thomas gathered his remaining strength and spoke directly to the journalist. "My name is Thomas Harrington, legal heir to Belmont Plantation. My mother held me prisoner for nearly 6 months, subjecting me to starvation and forced labor to change my appearance and break my will. I can provide detailed testimony about what was done to me and what I learned about similar programs. I can also prove my mother hid my father's legitimate will and operates Belmont through forged documents." The story was now too large and public to suppress easily. The journalist took notes. The crowd buzzed with conversation. Sheriff Bradford looked uncertain. Ruth clutched her journal and stayed close to Thomas, knowing they had gambled everything on this moment and would soon learn whether exposure would lead to justice or simply more sophisticated suppression and retaliation.